I'm Glenn Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glenn's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glenn's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glenn's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's program on Glenn's Parallax Perspectives TV series connects the dots between poverty in the United States and excessive military spending, including the costs of nuclear weapons. This TV program begins by recognizing the extent of poverty in the United States, the richest nation on earth. Poverty is not only a serious crisis, but it is also getting worse. Next, we'll recognize how excessively expensive the U.S. military has become. The U.S. spends a gigantic amount on the military, much, much more than is necessary. Both of the big political parties keep increasing military budgets far, far beyond reason. We'll spend a few minutes examining nuclear weapons in particular. We have far too many nuclear weapons, and their costs are outrageously excessive. After we've looked at these hard realities, I'll invite us to consider what the American people feel about these disparities, escalating poverty in the midst of escalating military spending. We also will consider what the American people's best values are. What do our nation's, excuse me just a second, I gotta turn down the buzzer. The timer on the kitchen stove was set to remind me to do the TV program. Okay, here we go. I'll pick this up again now. I'll pick it up from just a couple sentences ago, so there's a good flow here, instead of breaking it in mid-paragraph. After we've looked at these hard realities, I'll invite us to consider what the American people feel about these disparities, escalating poverty while escalating military spending. We also will consider what the American people's best values are. What do our nation's people really want and need? The second half of this program will propose some solutions that are humane and sensible. The peace movement and the civil rights movement have been raising these concerns for many decades. In the past few years, a new Poor People's Campaign has arisen and mobilized for economic and racial justice. In 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and many others were calling for our nation to undertake a bold revolution of values. They were building a broad-based movement to unite poor people and other people into a new movement to solve our nation's problems. Nationwide, it's www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. In Washington State, it's www.washingtonppc.org. So nowadays, a new
Poor People's Campaign describes itself as a national call for moral revival. And I've showed the national and state level websites on the screen. On Saturday, June 18, 2022, people from all over the U.S. convened in Washington, D.C. for a new March on Washington after the one from 1963. I'll post to my blog the video of this TV program and all of the images I'm sharing on the TV screen during this hour. You'll be able to watch this TV video and see these screen images on the TV programs part of my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And the word parallax has one R and two L's, Parallax, perspectives.org. And now on the screen, I'll show two images from the 1963 March on Washington. Here is one with Martin Luther King at the crowd. You can see the Washington Monument in the background. It's a pretty huge crowd. And the other one that I'll share with you is the crowd size itself. Here's the crowd with the Washington Monument. Pretty gigantic turnout. Next, I'll show a photo of the 2022 March on Washington that occurred in June of 2022. The Poor People's Campaign nowadays, as before, is linking many issues and movements, including poverty, peace issues, the peace movement, racial justice, and a lot of others. In that spirit, let's take some time now to discuss the relationship between poverty and our militaristic foreign policy, which includes a deadly addiction to nuclear weapons. Militarism, including nuclear weapons, diverts the vast wealth of America away from the legitimate needs of ending poverty, providing housing and medical care and education. Let's help the Poor People's Campaign's nationwide effort to move the U.S. away from all kinds of cruelty and oppression, including poverty and war, and replace those with public policies and an economic system that will be morally good, humane, and sustainable. So now let's consider some of these. Here's some information about poverty, economic inequality, and so forth. Many millions of Americans are very poor, and many millions more are just barely getting by. In the past few decades, the gap between very rich people and everybody else has been getting much wider. There's horrible inequality in incomes and also horrible inequality in wealth. Many Americans have negative wealth. They have more debts than assets. Meanwhile, billionaires and multimillionaires keep getting even more rich. The latest figures from the U.S. Department of Agriculture shows that more than 38 million people in the United States experienced hunger in 2020. Households with children were even more at risk. Now, as many as 1 in 6 kids are facing hunger this year. But federal intervention could help if Congress would fund it, but Congress does not help nearly enough. On August 12, 2021, I received an article reporting that nearly half of American workers do not earn enough to afford a one-bedroom rental. And the article also reported that a minimum wage job is not enough to afford a two-bedroom rental anywhere in the U.S. During the pandemic, about 1 in 7 Americans fell behind on rent payments, while housing costs continued to increase at an escalating rate. Poor people find it very hard to pay rent, and ordinary working class people likewise. On August 2, 2021, I received an article explaining that poor Americans also pay an invisible time tax, hours of work to apply for safety net programs, applications for benefits across key parts of the so-called safety net, food stamps, unemployment insurance, and so forth, Medicaid, a bunch of these, require individuals to waste hours of their lives proving eligibility, completing confusing paperwork, taking drug tests, and otherwise battling with federal and state bureaucracies to get the benefits that were supposedly meant to help them. In these ways, the government punishes poor people for being poor instead of recognizing the systemic causes of poverty. We need straightforward remedies for poverty caused by public policies instead of the current blame the victim programs. And as with many things in the United States, this time tax hurts people unevenly. Poor Americans and people of color are much more likely to spend their hours navigating the system, while wealthier and often white Americans are rarely asked to, say, pee in the cup to get benefits that we receive. The result of this institutional runaround is that fewer people are getting the benefits they need. For example, only 1 in 6 eligible persons receives food stamps. Also, people who are oppressed by poverty have less control over something very basic, their time, as I've mentioned. I want to show you on the screen something else that's pretty alarming. In a number of ways, the U.S. is a rogue nation. The U.S. is the only, or almost the only, modern industrial nation that fails to help its people and the world in these important ways. The U.S. healthcare system keeps ranking last among rich nations. The U.S. does not offer paid leave for new mothers, but 186 other nations do. The U.S. has not ratified the Cluster Munitions Treaty. The U.S. is one of only 14 members of the United Nations that have failed to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The U.S. is the only nation in the UN that has failed to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The only one is the U.S. The U.S. and Israel are the only members of the UN that voted to continue the U.S. embargo of Cuba in 2021. The U.S. and Ukraine were the only members of the UN that voted against a 2020 General Assembly resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and practices that promoted intolerance. The U.S. ranks high in world opinion polls as threatening the democracy rather than supporting democracy. And regarding international law, the U.S. has not ratified 2 Geneva Convention protocols from 1977, just about half a century ago. One relates to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts, and the other that we've not ratified is about the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. The United States has not ratified those. The U.S. also has failed to ratify 4 important environmental treaties: the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, the Basel Convention, which restricts moving hazardous waste between countries. In 2018, at the United Nations, 181 nations voted to help refugees. Only the US and Hungary voted no, do not help refugees. In 2018, the US was only one of 5 nations opposing a UN agreement on the environment. This is amazing stuff that just people do not know about. Also, on health issues, the U.S. is the world's richest nation, but we rank low among the world's nations on health outcomes. Among the 11 other rich advanced nations, the United States healthcare system ranks dead last in healthcare outcomes, access, equity, and efficiency, even though Americans spend much more per person on healthcare. And I have the link here, and I'll post that to my blog. Among the world's developed nations, the U.S. stands at or near the bottom in most important rankings of access to and quality of medical care. A 2000 study rated the U.S. 37th, just behind Dominica and Costa Rica, and just ahead of Slovenia and Cuba. Life expectancy for people who have reached the age of 60 is bad in the United States compared to other rich nations. A 2006 Commonwealth Fund study of 23 nations had the U.S. tied for last. The U.S. ranked last of 23 nations in keeping newborns alive. Other nations offer free prenatal and neonatal care for every mother and every baby. The U.S. does not offer prenatal and neonatal care for all mothers and babies. Avoidable mortality is a meaningful measure. A study of 19 wealthy countries showed the U.S. ranked last in curing people who could be cured with decent care. The U.S. death rate was nearly twice as high as in France, Japan, and Spain. Americans with chronic diseases such as asthma, diabetes, and so forth fared badly compared to other nations. Americans have a comparatively terrible rate of dying from surgery. More people die young in the U.S. than in other rich countries. In Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, and Switzerland, nobody goes bankrupt because of medical bills. But in the U.S., it's 700,000 people per year go bankrupt because of medical bills. This stuff is pretty amazing, especially for the richest nation on earth. Now, let's talk about where the money goes instead of going into the things that we've mentioned. The U.S. spends much, much more on the military than any other nation on earth. In 2020, the United States spent 3 times as much on healthcare. Let me bring up the image here. Let's see if I have the right. Yes, this is the right document. The U.S. spends much, much more on the military than any other nation on earth. We spent in 2020 3 times as much as China did. And we spent 12 times as much as Russia did. They want us to be afraid of Russia. We spent 12 times as much on the military. They want us to be afraid of China. We spent 3 times as much as they did. And you can see each of the next 7 nations that spent a lot on their militaries spent less than 73 billion in 2020, whereas the United States spent 778 billion. This is just a horrible anomaly, and it's a corruption in the world's richest nation that we put our money into that instead of into things that people need, like ending poverty and providing health care. These realities of military spending destroy the arguments of people who want us to be afraid of China and Russia and escalate our military spending even further. The U.S. outspends both China and Russia many times over. And also, if you consider our other nations, allies nations spending, the NATO nations and also non-NATO nations such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia, it's just phenomenally disproportionate. On January 31, 2022, the National Priorities Project, whose website is www.nationalpriorities.org, they're a savvy nonprofit organization that contrasts the budgets for military spending with the budgets for humane civilian purposes. They sent out information about the federal budget. Their information came from a publication produced by the Poor People's Campaign, which I mentioned already, poorpeoplescampaign.org, and some other good organizations. The publication contrasted what they called a moral budget versus a war budget. They reported that at the end of 2021, Congress failed to pass an investment in families, childcare, and climate that would have cost 170 billion. They failed to pass that, but Congress did pass a Pentagon budget more than 4 times that high. And I'll post to my blog the link to that article so you can see it there. And the publication I mentioned just now lists what the Build Back Better funding would have accomplished and what's in the National Defense Authorization Act, the Pentagon budget. Congress failed to pass the moral budget, but a huge bipartisan majority did overwhelmingly pass the National Defense Authorization Act that funds military violence lavishly. These 2 bills represent diametrically opposed views of how to address the challenges of our time, a moral budget versus a war budget. Congress is not on our side. Both political parties are not on our side. President Dwight Eisenhower said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed." This was Eisenhower back when we had some sensible Republicans. On December 20th, 2021, several organizations released their publication about this gross injustice, and that publication came from the Poor People's Campaign, which calls itself a national call for moral revival, and the Institute for Policy Studies, which I'll mention again in just a moment, Repairers of the Breach, and Kairos, the Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice. And I'll post to my blog the link to that article. I want to mention also something that came out from Ralph Nader's organization, Public Citizen, whose website is www.citizen.org. On April 5, 2022, they sent out some information about military spending. And here are their dollar amounts and a few of my additional thoughts. So one is the U.S.'s military budget for this year is a staggering $782 billion. For 2023, President Biden is asking for $813 billion. That's an additional $31 billion more than the current bloated military budget. Republicans and some Democrats in Congress are pressing for even more than that. Second point in their message is the Ukraine crisis is not a valid reason for Biden's request for $813 billion. It is more than 13 times what Russia spends on its military. In fact, this is more than the combined spending of the next 13 countries on the list of big military spenders: China, India, Russia, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Australia, Israel, and Canada. The article, here's the third point, the article sent by Public Citizen said, quote, "Throwing ever more money at the Pentagon is not about supporting the troops, improving national security, or making the world safer for democracy. It is about members of Congress using Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an excuse to funnel even more of our tax dollars to their friends at Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman," unquote. Okay, here's another thing from April 2, 2022, from another organization that I trust and support. It's Roots Action, www.rootsaction.org. They sent out some information. I edited their information slightly for the next few sentences, and I'll make, there are 4 points here. Last year, Congress increased military spending. It does that every year, but last year it did it even more stupidly and cruelly than usual. President Biden asked for a $12 billion increase. Republicans asked for a $25 billion increase beyond that. The Democratic Congress ultimately passed even more than the Republicans had proposed. Second point, this year Biden proposed increasing military spending by $31 billion over last year's spending. Point three, actually the public wants to spend less because we have better sense than Congress does, and we are not corrupted by campaign donations from weapons manufacturers. Fourth point, we should be insisting that each member of Congress publicly and emphatically commit to voting no on any bill that funds military spending at more than 90% of the past year's extravagant level. Just a second, let me. I set the phone to not ring, but it rings anyhow, so let's proceed here. I keep seeing a familiar pattern that contrasts what politicians keep saying and doing. Politicians keep saying the U.S. cannot afford to clean up the environment or protect the climate. Politicians keep saying the U.S. cannot afford to end homelessness and poverty. Politicians keep saying the U.S. cannot afford to provide good health care for everybody, and cannot afford good education, and cannot afford serious efforts to protect everybody from COVID. But despite those denials, the politicians always keep spending more and more for war, including nuclear weapons. We must tell the politicians to stop those horribly immoral budget priorities, and we must vote them out of office if they do. Now we must also tell politicians to stop claiming that Russia's invasion of Ukraine makes them spend more for the military. The US's military spending was already far, far too much for many decades before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The US military was already spending about 12 times as much as Russia's military, as I said. I want to show another interesting thing here on the screen that compares nuclear weapons stockpiles. In 2021, about 13,000 nuclear warheads existed worldwide, according to the Arms Control Association, www.armscontrol.org. I'm showing on the screen an image of how many nuclear weapons are owned by each of the 9 nations that have nuclear weapons. About 90% of these belong to the United States and Russia. And you'll see those tally marks on the left side and right side of the screen. After George W. Bush and Donald Trump destroyed several important treaties that limited nuclear weapons of the US and Russia, the New START treaty was practically the only one left between the US and Russia. Trump was allowing New START to expire also, but in January 2021, Biden extended it for 5 years. New START caps each country at 1,550 strategic deployed warheads. The number of deployed warheads in both Russia and the US are below New START's limit of 1,550 each. Each nation also has a few thousand missiles not currently ready to launch. Russia has 1,458 ready to launch. These strategic nuclear warheads are deployed on 527 intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. The U.S. has 1,389 ready to launch. These strategic nuclear warheads are deployed on 665 intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. The U.S. also has an estimated 100 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs that are forward deployed at 6 NATO bases in 5 European nations. Again, see this screen showing the disproportionate number of weapons the U.S. and Russia have. We have about 90% of the world's totals. The other 7 nations have far fewer. China has 350. France has 290. The UK has 225. Pakistan 165. India 156. Israel 90. And North Korea 50. Altogether, those 7 nations have only about 10% of the world's deployed nuclear weapons, while 90% are owned by the US and Russia. I want to bring up the screen about the money. In 2019, the 9 nations with nuclear weapons spent these amounts on their nuclear weapons. And you can see the United States spent about as much as all other nations combined. We spent about $35 billion on it, and the whole world spent just over $70 billion. So we're just about half. And you'll see the number 2 nation with China spent less than a third of what the United States spent. Below that, UK was less than that. Russia was less than what the UK spent, and then France below that, and then India and the others below that. In 2019, the US spent very nearly as much on nuclear weapons as all other nations combined. In 2019, the nations that have nuclear weapons spent a total of $72.9 billion on them. The US spent about as much as the other nations combined. I'll look again for that thing. Dennis, you might want to edit out my fidgeting here as I'm trying to find these things. let me bring it up from another source. Okay, hold on a second. Well, Dennis, I'm just not finding that screen, so you'll have to just drop this part out. Let's see. Pick this back up again here. I can't get rid of this. Okay. Okay, you got some stuff to delete here, Dennis. Let me repeat this again. In 2019, the US spent very nearly as much on nuclear weapons as all other nations combined. In 2019, the 9 nations that have nuclear weapons spent a total of $72.9 billion on them. The US spent about as much as all of the other 8 nations with nuclear weapons combined. And I'll have information about this to the post to my blog. Let's see. Dang, I had this stuff up here and I'm not seeing it there now. Dennis, I'll have to send this to you and let me put a paper clip on it. You'll have to do this in post-production. I had it open and I don't know why it's not appearing now. Yeah. Now we've laid out the facts, and now I wonder, how do you feel about these hard realities? During 4 years, Trump kept escalating military spending to unconscionable level, beyond the unconscionable level that he had inherited from previous presidents. And then now in each of 2 years, Biden has horribly escalated military spending even beyond that. In Congress, both political parties keep escalating military budgets even beyond the reckless escalations that Biden had proposed. Congress keeps escalating military budgets even while Congress keeps saying we can't afford to feed hungry children or reduce poverty or protect the environment. The American people strongly oppose these huge bipartisan military budgets. Only a relatively few members of Congress have spoken up publicly, boldly, against this reckless cruelty. In February 2022, Representative Pramila Jayapal denounced Biden's $770 billion Pentagon budget proposal as absurd. An article from February 16, 2022 includes these 3 points. 1, the expected budget request, first reported by Reuters on Wednesday, is tens of billions of dollars more than former Republican President Donald Trump ever requested, and contrasts with widespread public demand for increased investment for middle and lower class Americans and an end to bloated military budgets. Point 2 in this article says the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, pointed to recent polling by the organization which showed that 54% of adults in the US want the exact opposite of increased military spending. Point 3, the article also quotes William Hartung, one of our nation's best informed experts on military spending, who said, quote, devoting this enormous sum to the Pentagon at a time when the greatest challenges to our security, from pandemics to climate change, are not military in nature, is both misguided and counterproductive. And I'll post to my blog the link to that article. So how do you feel about this bipartisan mania for excessive military spending while the federal government refuses to fund programs to end homelessness and poverty, provide safe drinking water, protect our health, clean up the environment, and provide high quality education. I encourage you to pay attention to how you feel at the head level and at the heart level. And besides feeling, we need to take smart actions. Let's organize a strong grassroots movement to help the public move from feelings to smart, compassionate actions based on the public's values and needs. The entire concept of militarism is based on the mistaken assumption that killing people in other countries solves problems. Military violence is cruel and brings out the worst of people, including racism and hatred of the other. Military violence violates humane values. Governments reject humane values because they prioritize war over life and because the federal government is funded, the federal government elected officials are funded by weapons manufacturers. We can do better than that, and we must do better than that. Poverty and militarism violate our core values and needs. Ordinary people strongly need and support profound fairness, compassion, respect for living beings, and safety and security for all people and for our global environment. Americans like to think that we live in a democracy. Actually, we live in a republic where we elect other people to run local, state, and national governments. If we really had a democracy, then we, the people, would be directly deciding what our governments would do at local, state, and federal levels. The American people want more democracy, more honesty. Instead, Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court have been allowing extremely rich people and big businesses to bribe political candidates with big money donations for their campaigns, and those economic elites spend many millions of dollars lobbying the politicians after they're elected. Solving the problems about excessive military spending and the government's refusal to end poverty requires that we reform elections and governmental functioning in several ways. We need remedies that are smart and compassionate. We need remedies that fix our nation's unjust systems. My June 2022 TV program focuses on how big money corrupts our elections, and it also proposes some smart solutions. People everywhere can visit my blog at any time to watch this TV interview and read the thorough summary I typed up. This thorough summary includes links to more information. Visit parallaxperspectives.org, click TV programs, and scroll down to that episode's title, Big Money in Elections Corrupts Our Government. Too often we hear ordinary people and politicians blame the victims of our economic system. Trump specialized in this. He kept calling people losers. He did not mean that they were losing because capitalism is unfair, or they're losing because they're being hurt by systemic social injustice and discrimination. No, Trump's definition of a loser was personal blame against the individuals who have been victimized by our systems in our society and our economy, and he blamed those victims as losers. In order to solve the problems, we have to recognize that our political and economic systems cause the problems that make people poor. Also, our political and economic systems divert our nation's resources into military violence and corruption. Here's a good example from the local level. The Thurston County, Washington voters pamphlet for the August 3, 2021 primary election included statements from candidates. A number of the candidates addressed homelessness in ways that blame the victims. They blame homeless people themselves. Those candidates complained that homeless people have substance abuse problems and they have mental illness. I'll show on the screen something that deals with the systemic problems that are not being addressed by hardly any politicians. The systemic problems that cause homelessness include the horribly widening gap between very rich people and everybody else, stagnant wages relative to inflation since the mid-1970s, real estate developers' exploitation and gentrification that force people into homelessness because they can't afford to pay the escalating rents. Persistent biases against racial minorities, LGBTQ persons, young people, low-income people, and so forth, and Congress's persistent refusal to create a system that would provide high-quality health care at affordable prices for every person in our nation. So why do almost no candidates recognize the systemic problems that cause homelessness? And I showed those on the screen. Smart, ethical information does exist out and about there, but almost no candidates publicize the smart and ethical information, and almost no candidates go beyond paying lip service to and actually push for legislation that would strongly promote and protect our best values, such as truth, fairness, compassion, and profound economic and social justice. So I invite people to watch some of my TV programs through my blog, and you can either watch the video and or read the thorough summaries I typed up of what we said during those TV programs. Some of those programs deal with the kinds of persistent underlying problems that we're discussing during this hour. The TV program's topics provide fresh information and insights into homelessness, systemic economic injustices, local government abuses that serve real estate developers at the expense of people who need affordable housing, local environmental abuses, and so forth. The May 2021 TV program, for example, featured national experts addressing nationwide economic justice issues in bold and informative ways. Two previous programs had addressed the, quote, missing middle, which is a housing plan for cities, and related exploitations by the real estate developer sector and the city of Olympia. March of 2019 program title was called What's Wrong with the Missing Middle, and the April 2020 program I titled Affordable Housing, Facts and Myths About the Missing Middle. You also might find insights from my July 2019 program about homelessness, which I titled Houselessness, Human Dignity, and the Right to Survive. Also, my blog has a number of issue categories about economics and military spending and a whole bunch of things. So you can visit parallaxperspectives.org to see information there. Our society can solve our problems only if we understand the problems and understand the solutions, and if we empower ourselves to organize at the grassroots to make necessary political changes. New legislation in Congress asserts that it's not only possible to end poverty, but also morally necessary. In June 2021, I read about a new plan to end poverty in the US. I posted it to my blog's economics category. This article was written by Sarah Anderson, a nationwide expert on economic justice. I interviewed her for my May 2021 program that I mentioned just a moment ago, and you can watch that interview through the TV programs part of my blog. Sarah's article begins with these short paragraphs, which I'll read to you. Amidst partisan haggling over Biden's infrastructure proposal, the Poor People's Campaign and several lawmakers recently outlined a comprehensive moral vision for the nation. They believe it's not only possible to end poverty in this country, but morally necessary. It's unforgivable that 250,000 people die every year in this country from poverty and inequality, said Representative Barbara Lee during a press conference to unveil a sweeping congressional resolution for a third Reconstruction. The resolution's title draws on the transformational history of the first Reconstruction following the Civil War and the second Reconstruction of the 20th century civil rights movement, two periods during which multiracial coalitions achieved significant strides toward racial and economic justice. Representative Pramila Jayapal stressed that a new era of transformational change will require new policy choices. Quote, we allow poverty to continue when 55 of the largest corporations paid not $1 in taxes last year, when we let our health system be focused on profits, not patients, unquote. That's what Jayapal said. And then Sarah Anderson's article continued that Lee and Jayapal were flanked by Poor People's Campaign co-chairs Reverend Dr. William Barber II and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. What is the cost of inequality? Asked Barber, pointing out that billionaire wealth has increased by more than $1.3 trillion during the pandemic, while millions have fallen into poverty. This is a moral issue rooted in the moral commitments of our Constitution. The first thing we had to do is establish justice, promote the general welfare, and to ensure equal protection under the law. The congressional resolution lays out a roadmap for achieving those lofty goals. So that's the end of the quotation from Sarah Anderson's smart article. In late December 2021, more information about the federal budget came out. And I mentioned this information earlier in this TV program, just after discussing nuclear weapons spending. And I provided the web link from different co-sponsoring organizations. Now, here's similar information about the federal budget from another organization that researches and reports on such matters. This is the Institute for Policy Studies. Their website is www.ips-dc.org. I'm posting to my blog the direct link to their very smart report. Since the 1970s, I've been reading materials researched and written by the Institute for Policy Studies, and I've been donating financial support. And the article I mentioned just now contrasts the Build Back Better Act and the National Defense Authorization Act. I mentioned these earlier, and it calls these respectively a moral budget and a war budget. Congress failed to pass the moral budget, but it passed the war budget with a gigantic bipartisan majority, as I said earlier in this TV program. We have to keep putting pressure on Congress to fund human needs instead of military violence. The peace organization World Beyond War produced a powerful billboard about military spending and hunger. It says 3% of the U.S. military spending could end starvation on Earth. A document explaining the numbers is at a link that I'm posting to my blog. In February 2021, a Quaker-based organization, the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, www.afsc.org, produced a document titled How to Build Support for Cutting Pentagon Spending. A new AFSC poll found most people want to reduce military spending and reinvest that money in programs that benefit everyone. AFSC offered some tips that you can use in talking with other people to build more support for cutting U.S. spending on weapons and war. And I'm posting to my blog the link to AFSC's 4 suggestions, and I'm posting to the screen here a summary, which I will flesh out. Here it is. They list these 4 ways to move public opinion toward cutting military budget. We need to do outreach to the public to build this movement. And so their first point is to remind people that war is a way to divide us and that we have to reject false divisions along lines of race and class. And they have 3 supporting points under that point number 1. One is the United States should be a place where everyone can thrive. That means we cannot let politicians divide us based on what we look like, where we come from, or how much money we have. Second point there is, and yet when the U.S. bombs communities abroad, buys weapons instead of paying for health care, and invests in military contractors instead of sustainable jobs, that's exactly what they're doing, dividing us. And the third point under their point number 1 says, when you're talking with others about Pentagon spending, remind them that war is the product of artificial division. It's up to us to recognize the dignity of each human being, no matter what. Once we do that, we can all work together to make life better for everyone. Okay, here's their second point, you'll see as number 2. Remind people that when we work together, big changes are possible. Going up against Congress and special interests feels intimidating, but we've done it before. When people have joined together across divisions, we've won big changes like civil rights and higher wages. They also say, in support of their point number 2, today individuals, community groups, and organizations are collaborating to reduce military spending. Last year, 26,000 people signed AFSC's petition calling for cuts to the Pentagon budget, and over 30 faith groups signed our letter to President Biden asking that his budget include less money for the military. They also say, by coming together, we can demand our leaders deliver better healthcare, schools, and jobs instead of more money for weapons, war, and the military contractors. Their point number 3 has these sub-points under it. One is the Pentagon's bloated budget is more than a number. It represents massive human suffering, corporate and political corruption, and a waste of taxpayer dollars. Since 9/11, more than 929,000 people have died due to global military conflict, and 38 million more have been displaced. The human suffering caused by war is compounded by militarism's contribution to climate disruption. The U.S. military is one of the world's top producers of greenhouse gases and the largest institutional consumer of oil. Their point number 3 also has these additional reasonings. Corruption runs rampant in the war machine. Each year, about half the money spent on the Pentagon goes to private military contractors that build weapons, surveillance systems, and other tools of war. These military contractors spend millions of dollars each year lobbying the government to make decisions that are good for their bottom line, not for our communities. Despite the massive amount of spending each year on the military, the Pentagon has never passed an audit. Waste, fraud, and abuse run rampant within the department. And their 4th point here has some sub-points under it. Point 4 says, remind people about what's important, things like healthcare, economic opportunity, and housing. And they add, true security for our communities happens when we invest in healthcare, economic opportunity, and housing. When we ensure people have the resources they need to thrive, we create safer, healthier communities for all. If Congress had chosen to spend money on our communities instead of weapons and war this year, we could have paid for over 21 million four-year university scholarships or created over 10 million clean energy jobs. So the next time you're talking about Pentagon spending, say something like, quote, our strength comes from our ability to work together, bringing people together from different places and different races. For the U.S. to be a place where everyone can thrive, we cannot let the 1% and the politicians they pay for divide us against each other based on what someone looks like, where they come from, or how much money they have. We need to join together to build a better and more peaceful future, just like we've won civil rights and higher wages in the past. By coming together, we can demand our leaders deliver better healthcare, schools, and jobs, not more money for weapons, war, and corporate military contractors, unquote. So that's pretty good stuff. I want to share some more strategies here. Dennis, I need to take a drink of water here. I'm going dry. Let's pursue smart strategies for ending poverty, such as challenging capitalism and its systemic abuses. The free market caused the problem of economic inequality, including homelessness, and the free market ideology is making it worse now. The free market cannot solve homelessness or poverty because the free market is what caused those problems initially. We must recognize housing as a human right. The federal government must take strong actions. I'm posting to my blog an article link that provides information and insights for promoting bold federal actions to make housing a human right. Taxing extreme wealth would lift 2.3 billion people worldwide out of poverty. For years, Chuck Collins has been writing very knowledgeable and insightful articles about economic inequality. Chuck Collins directs the program on inequality for the Institute for Policy Studies, which I mentioned earlier, www.ips-dc.org. That's an organization that I've been reading their materials from and donating financial support since the 1970s. Chuck Collins co-edits www.inequality.org at that organization. I'm posting to my blog the link to an article that summarizes some important information and urges us to vigorously tax rich people. The article begins with these paragraphs. Quote, the pandemic has shown a spotlight on how inequality kills. As inequalities in income, wealth, and access to healthcare have accelerated, the world's most economically precarious people have suffered far more than their fair share of death and economic loss. As a new Oxfam report points out, inequality contributes to the deaths of more than 21,000 people each day. And make no mistake, the pandemic is making inequality worse. Oxfam reports that 99% of the world's workers earned less money than they would have if the pandemic hadn't happened. Meanwhile, the world's 500 richest people saw their wealth increase by $1 trillion last year. And here in the US, the combined wealth of our 745 billionaires has increased by over $2 trillion since the pandemic began, unquote. On February 16, 2022, the statewide Poverty Action Network, whose website is www.povertyaction.org, sent information explaining that Washington State needs a guaranteed basic income. Their article says that each of us is the expert in our own lives and knows how to take care of our needs better than anyone else. So direct, unrestricted cash provides the dignity and the choice for people to be able to take care of ourselves and our families. During the 2022 Washington State legislative session, House Bill 2009 was introduced to start a statewide guaranteed basic income program. But because legislative sessions are shorter in even-numbered years, the Housing, Human Services, and Veterans Committee prioritized renter protection bills, so there was not enough time for a public hearing on House Bill 2009. I'm posting to my blog a link to information about HB 2009. In late July 2021, U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar introduced a guaranteed income bill to send American adults $1,200 a month. And I'm posting to my blog the link to an article about this federal guaranteed income bill. The article begins with these paragraphs, which I've edited very slightly here for the TV program. Representative Ilhan Omar, Democrat from Minnesota, plans to introduce a bill that would create a guaranteed income program that would send $1,200 a month to most Americans. The bill, she argues, could be a major step toward ending poverty in the United States. The SUPPORT Act, and support is S-U-P-P-O-R-T, capital letters, because it's the acronym for the whole title of the bill. The initials spell out support. The SUPPORT Act would send $1,200 a month to U.S. adults making up to $75,000 a year, or a head of household making up to $112,500 a year, with supplemental income for children, according to HuffPost. HuffPost is a news source. The bill would phase out payments at higher income brackets. The bill strives to include groups that are traditionally left out of government aid, like the recent COVID stimulus checks. Undocumented immigrants who file taxes with an ITIN would be included. People without banking accounts experiencing homelessness could also access payments through a banking system run by the U.S. Postal Service. The SUPPORT Act has been co-sponsored by several other House members. It faces long odds in the Congress. An article at HuffPost says, Representative Omar said, quote, "For too long, we've prioritized endless growth while millions are homeless, hungry, or without health care. We as a nation have the ability to make sure everyone has their basic needs like food, housing, and health care met," unquote. A study by the Federal Reserve published in 2019 found that almost 40% of Americans did not have $400 in savings, leaving them vulnerable if unexpected expenses were to arise. So if you're finding this TV program informative, please share it with your friends. Anyone can visit my blog and watch the program through www.parallaxperspectives.org. And again, Parallax has one R and two L's, P-A-R-A-L-L-A-X, perspectives.org. So visit the blog and click any one of these categories on the blog, either TV programs, or peace, or military spending, or nuclear weapons, or race, or economics. When I post to my blog the transcript of what I'm saying, you'll be able to click live links to all of the organizations and articles that I mentioned during this hour. There have been quite a lot of them. I thank the people who've been watching this program. Our society is plagued by a variety of systemic injustices, and those problems keep getting worse. We really can solve these problems if we inform ourselves and inform each other, and if we empower ourselves to join together in a good, big grassroots movement to strategically take smart actions. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, nonviolence, the environment, and lots of other issues through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org, or you can phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thanks so much.